My name is Victoria Mitchell, and I am 32 years old. I was sitting on a wobbly plastic chair in a sweltering parking lot tent, drinking tap water out of a paper cup, while my brother Nathan celebrated his $200,000 wedding inside the main ballroom. Just 20 minutes earlier, my mother Caroline had grabbed my arm, squeezing hard enough to leave crescent-shaped bruises. She dragged me out the side exit and hissed that my clearance rack navy dress and my boring data entry job would humiliate the family in front of his wealthy investors. She told me to stay out of sight with the catering staff so I would not ruin his perfect corporate image. I simply nodded and walked into the humid Wisconsin evening. Then, a billionaire CEO walked past the staff tent, stopped dead in his tracks, and asked why the majority shareholder of his entire hospitality conglomerate was wearing a maid uniform. Before I tell you how this single encounter led to the financial destruction of my toxic family, drop your age in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to Grape Echo Stories if you have ever had to smile through the pain of being underestimated. Now let me bring you into the heat of that catering tent. The smell of melting ice and hot asphalt hung thick in the air. Through the open French doors of the Lake Geneva resort, the sounds of a live jazz band and clinking crystal drifted into the muggy summer night. A waiter bumped my table carrying a silver tray of seared scallops, oblivious to the fact that I was not a hired hand resting on a smoke break. I slouched my shoulders, letting a few drops of water spill onto my skirt. I perfected the posture of a defeated, socially awkward outcast. I played the clumsy, nervous failure my family always assumed me to be. But beneath the draped white tablecloth, resting quietly on my lap, sat a heavily encrypted tablet. The thick vinyl flap of the tent parted. Alexander Montgomery, the Chief Executive Officer of Great Lakes Hospitality, stepped into the enclosure seeking a brief escape from the suffocating crowd. His gaze swept the staging area, dismissing the stacked chairs and discarded linens until his eyes locked onto mine. The commanding executive froze mid-stride, his brow furrowed in profound bewilderment. He looked at my stained, inexpensive dress, then back up to my face, struggling to reconcile the contradiction sitting before him. "Wait," he murmured, his deep voice, carrying a note of pure disbelief. "Aren't you the majority owner of this company?" I did not flinch. I slowly raised a single finger to my lips, issuing a silent command for discretion. Alexander stepped closer, his polished Oxford silent against the temporary astroturf. As he approached my small folding table, he noticed the faint blue light glowing beneath the tablecloth. He leaned down, peering at the screen. The confusion on his face morphed into a sharp, predatory fascination. He watched lines of digital ledgers and offshore routing numbers cascade across the display in real time. I was not weeping over my exile. I was actively monitoring the internal escrow accounts of the very resort holding my brother's reception. My family thought they had successfully swept a pathetic nuisance under the rug. They had no idea they had just granted a silent architect the perfect vantage point to detonate a synchronized financial trap. I just needed Nathan to boast a little louder, drink a little more champagne, and dig his own grave a fraction deeper before I severed his lifeline. Alexander pulled a flimsy white plastic chair from a stack near the staff cooler. The metal legs scraped softly against the temporary astroturf as he folded his tall frame into the inadequate seat. The sheer juxtaposition of a billionaire hospitality magnate sitting in a humid catering tent was striking. He did not demand an immediate explanation or raise his voice. He simply leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, fascinated by the quiet digital espionage taking place on my lap. I kept my posture relaxed, ensuring my demeanor reflected the cold, calculated reality of the situation, rather than the emotional distress my mother hoped to inflict. "I have spent the last hour observing the dynamic inside that ballroom," Alexander murmured, his deep baritone, blending seamlessly with the distant jazz music. "Your father cornered my chief financial officer near the ice sculptures. He boasted that you were an administrative assistant who lacked the basic social grace to attend a formal evening event. He painted a very convincing picture of a tragic, burdensome relative." I offered a tight, closed smile, keeping my eyes fixed on the glowing screen of my tablet. "Edward Mitchell has always possessed a remarkable talent for self-deception," I replied. "To my family, I am exactly what they need me to be. I am a gray shadow they can safely ignore while they shine a spotlight on their golden boy." I swiped my finger across the smooth glass, bringing the live security feed of the main hall into sharp focus. The high-definition monitor displayed Nathan throwing his head back in laughter, adjusting the cuffs of a custom tuxedo. My family worshipped the fragile illusion of high society. They craved prestige with a hunger that blinded them to basic mathematics. While my mother financed her elite country club memberships on revolving credit, and my father leased foreign cars to project an air of old money, they entirely forgot the genuine legacy of the man who built our foundation. I spoke quietly to Alexander, painting the true history of my wealth. My late grandfather was a man carved directly from the Wisconsin soil. He spent his life working the sprawling dairy farms near the coastlines of the Great Lakes. He smelled of rain-soaked earth and diesel fuel. He never cared about designer labels or local gossip. He taught me the mechanics of heavy machinery, the cyclical nature of agricultural markets, and the undeniable value of grueling, silent labor. He always told me that empty barrels make the most noise while a full silo stands perfectly still. When he passed away, he left me a modest financial inheritance. My parents scoffed at the sum, deeming it insufficient to fund their extravagant tastes. They demanded I hand it over to help finance Nathan through a prestigious business program. I refused their demand. That was the day they officially branded me a selfish failure and decided to treat me like a lower-class citizen in my own home. I took that modest seed money and vanished into the background. I utilized the precise analytical skills my grandfather instilled in me to study the regional economy. Wisconsin thrives on dairy production and paper manufacturing. I identified distressed commercial plots near the major inland lakes, purchased them through anonymous shell companies, and leased them back to major agricultural conglomerates. I reinvested every single dollar. Over the past decade, I constructed a sprawling real estate and agricultural portfolio. I hired elite legal minds to structure impenetrable blind trusts. My name never appeared on a public registry or a property deed. I insulated myself flawlessly from my family and their toxic financial parasitism. Great Lakes Hospitality, the very resort group hosting this wedding, was merely one of my more recent acquisitions. I bought it quietly 3 years ago when the previous board faced a severe liquidity crisis. Alexander leaned closer to the screen, the faint light reflecting in his dark eyes. He watched the digital feed with the focused intensity of a fellow predator. The camera angled down over the VIP tables, capturing Edward, red-faced and blustering, holding a crystal glass of bourbon. "Your father is currently threatening the catering director," Alexander noted, observing the footage. "He is promising to call the owner of this resort in the morning to demand an immediate termination because the appetizers were served a few degrees too cold." The irony was a potent, intoxicating nectar. "He expects the owner to be a sympathetic golfing buddy," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "He has no concept that the owner is currently sitting in a sweltering parking lot drinking tap water because she was deemed unpresentable for his social climbing." I tapped the screen, switching the camera feed to the center of the dance floor. Nathan was holding court with 3 men wearing expensive tailored suits. Alexander stiffened slightly, recognizing his own venture capital colleagues from the city. Nathan was gesturing wildly, projecting the manic energy of a desperate salesman. "He is pitching them," Alexander said, his jaw setting into a hard line. "He has been circling my investors all evening talking about a revolutionary heavy machinery export business. He claims to have exclusive manufacturing contracts ready to deploy across the Midwest." "He does not own a single warehouse," I clarified, watching my brother orchestrate his scam in real time. "He does not possess a single manufacturing contract. He rents a small office in a strip mall and prints glossy brochures. He is using this wedding as a theatrical backdrop to convince your investors that he is a titan of industry. He needs their seed capital to pay off his existing personal debts." Alexander shook his head, a flicker of genuine disgust crossing his features. "It is a textbook Ponzi scheme wrapped in white tulle and expensive floral arrangements. I should walk in there right now and have security escort him off the property. My firm does not tolerate predatory grifters." I reached out and gently touched his forearm. The fabric of his suit was smooth and cool. "Do not interrupt him," I advised, my voice steady and commanding. "Never stop an enemy while he is enthusiastically documenting his own lies. Let him hand his fraudulent business cards to your colleagues. Let him make verbal promises in front of witnesses. The higher he climbs the scaffolding of his own ego, the more devastating the impact will be when I remove the floorboards." Alexander relaxed his stance, deferring to my strategic patience. He looked at me with a newfound, profound respect. "If his export business is a total fabrication," Alexander asked, his sharp mind connecting the lingering variables, "how exactly did a man drowning in lease payments afford to rent my premier ballroom? This reception alone exceeds $200,000. A cold mechanical calmness settled over my entire body. This was the exact pivot point where petty family cruelty crossed the undeniable threshold into severe criminality. I closed the security camera application and opened my secure banking portal. The screen shifted from the bright colors of the wedding reception to stark black and white columns of financial data. "That is the precise reason I am sitting in this tent," I explained, tapping a specific encrypted folder labeled with my brother's name. "My family believes I am a harmless data entry clerk who lacks the spine to question their authority. They assumed I would simply bow my head and accept my banishment to the parking lot. They failed to realize that people who handle data for a living know exactly how to find the missing numbers." I navigated through a series of complex firewalls I had built to monitor my isolated personal accounts. I brought up a digitized scan of a legal banking document. The ink on the screen was fresh. The stakes of the evening were about to mutate from a tragic domestic dispute into a full-blown prosecutable offense. "Nathan did not pay for this wedding with business profits," I stated, letting the heavy reality hang in the humid air between us. "He funded this entire spectacle through a mechanism far more sinister than a fake export pitch." My fingers moved across the smooth glass of my tablet, navigating past the resort external firewalls to access the internal escrow accounts. 4 months ago, Nathan invited me to a cheap diner. He slid a glossy prospectus across a sticky table, claiming he desperately needed a bridge loan to secure a paper production plant in Green Bay. He promised exponential returns and guaranteed stock options. I drank my black coffee, read the first page, and pushed the folder back. His revenue projections were pure fiction, and his operating costs ignored basic supply chain logistics. I refused to fund a sinking ship. He stormed out, cursing my lack of vision and leaving me with the check. I assumed he had simply moved on to find another gullible investor. I was wrong. Looking at the digital paper trail populating on my screen, the truth materialized in undeniable black ink. He did not just walk away from that diner. He forged my signature on a series of complex authorization forms. He systematically siphoned $300,000 from a locked generational trust my grandfather had established specifically for future agricultural land acquisitions. He bypassed the primary alerts by routing the capital through a series of phantom vendor accounts. Alexander watched the data cascade across my screen, his jaw tightening until a muscle ticked near his ear. "He stole your inheritance to buy ice sculptures," Alexander whispered, his tone laced with heavy disgust. "He bought much more than carved ice," I replied, pulling up the itemized vendor receipts from the venue billing department. "The stolen funds financed the vintage champagne towers, the imported orchids, and the raw silk table linens currently dazzling your colleagues. Every single bite of caviar consumed in that ballroom was paid for by the dairy farm legacy he always mocked. The sheer audacity required to steal from the sister you publicly humiliate requires a special breed of narcissism. But Nathan is only half of the equation." I opened a secondary secure file containing legal documents forwarded to me by my corporate attorney, Vincent. To truly understand the gravity of the impending implosion, you have to understand the bride. Melissa presents herself as a self-made fashion mogul running a chain of overpriced suburban boutiques. She is obsessed with curating an image of untouchable wealth. From the moment Nathan proposed, she treated my family like a stepping stone. She viewed my unassuming clothes and quiet demeanor as a threat to her pristine aesthetic. During a rehearsal dinner, she firmly demanded that Nathan set strict boundaries against what she termed freeloading relatives like Victoria. Her desperation to protect her fragile boutique empire led her to make a fatal strategic error. I showed Alexander a scanned copy of a legal contract. Melissa fiercely demanded a rock-solid, ironclad prenuptial agreement before walking down the aisle. She wanted to ensure that if the marriage dissolved, my family could never touch her retail assets. She drafted the initial terms with her own lawyers, focused entirely on shielding her imaginary fortune. But she underestimated the cunning desperation of a drowning man. Nathan agreed to her demands with suspicious eagerness. He took the contract to his own cut-rate legal counsel for final revisions before they signed it. I zoomed in on page 14 of the digitized document, highlighting a dense block of obscure legal text. "It is the ultimate hidden trap door," I explained, pointing to the specific clause. Melissa thought this document built an impenetrable fortress around her boutiques. She was entirely unaware that Nathan buried a specific indemnification clause deep within the liability section. The text legally intertwines their corporate entities upon the finalization of their union. He shifted the burden of his failing dummy corporations onto her retail holdings. Alexander read the clause, his eyes widening slightly as the horrific legal reality settled in. The tension ratcheted up instantly. They signed the ceremonial documents during the ceremony, but the binding state marriage license requires a final witness signature at the reception tonight. The moment that ink dries, Melissa stops being a shielded entity. She legally absorbs his staggering non-dischargeable debt. Every stolen dollar, every forged line of credit, and every unpaid lease associated with his fake export business becomes her direct financial responsibility. She demanded a shield, and he handed her an anchor. The beauty of the arrangement lay in its profound poetic justice. The bride who looked down on me for drinking tap water in a tent was minutes away from signing away her entire financial future to the man she thought would elevate her social status. They were two parasites unknowingly feeding on each other. My hand hovered over the tablet. I had the power to freeze the escrow accounts right now, cutting off the final payments to the catering staff and forcing a public halt to the reception. It would be a messy, chaotic scene, but I craved a surgical strike. I needed to wait for the exact moment the legal trap snapped shut around both of their necks. The humid air inside the tent felt thick-heavy with the scent of trampled grass and discarded food. The jazz band transitioned into a slow, triumphant melody, signaling the approaching hour of the best man toast. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool, smooth edge of the tablet against my fingertips. Years of enduring their snide remarks, their rolled eyes, and their blatant disrespect culminated in this solitary, glowing screen. They built a towering castle on a fault line of lies. My grandfather built barns to withstand brutal Midwestern winters, relying on solid timber and honest sweat. He knew that a weak foundation always crumbles under the first sign of a storm. Nathan constructed his life from forged paper and stolen credit. The $300,000 drawn from the trust was earmarked for a very specific plot of fertile farmland near the coast. I had spent months negotiating the zoning rights for a sustainable dairy cooperative. Nathan saw those funds as unearned cash sitting idle waiting to be spent on fleeting validation. He assumed my financial monitors were as negligent as his own. He failed to comprehend that my elite corporate attorney, Vincent, deployed automated tracking algorithms on every single account bearing my name. The moment Nathan forged my signature, Vincent flagged the anomaly. We watched the money move. We tracked it through the phantom vendors. We allowed the theft to proceed specifically to build an ironclad federal case. Alexander leaned back in his plastic chair, processing the sheer scale of the orchestrated ruin. "You did not just come here to ruin a party," he stated, his voice carrying a deep resonance of respect. "You came here to execute a corporate liquidation of your own bloodline." I looked at the billionaire CEO, recognizing a kindred spirit who understood the necessity of ruthless precision. "You cannot cure a rot by pruning the leaves," I replied softly. "You have to pull the entire diseased root from the soil." Nathan and Melissa are about to discover what happens when you steal from the earth and expect nothing to grow in its place. They wanted a high society lifestyle funded by my silent labor, and they are about to receive the exact bill for their arrogance. The catering staff continued to rush past our secluded corner, carrying empty silver platters and half-finished bottles of imported wine. None of them spared a second glance at the woman in the plain navy dress or the man in the bespoke suit sitting on cheap plastic chairs. To the untrained eye, we were just two tired employees taking a break from the relentless demands of the wealthy elite. But beneath the surface of that mundane image, a financial guillotine was being raised to its highest peak. I reached out to execute the digital lock on the offshore routing numbers, preparing the final phase of the snare. The screen illuminated my face, casting a pale glow in the dim tent. But before my finger could tap the final command prompt to engage the federal tracking, A sudden shift in the ambient light caught my attention. The heavy canvas flap of the catering tent rustled loudly. The distant chatter of the ballroom was temporarily amplified, then muffled again. A tall, looming shadow fell directly over my small plastic table, eclipsing the glow of my screen. The scent of expensive bourbon and stale cigar smoke invaded my quiet sanctuary. I did not need to look up to know who had just breached my perimeter. The heavy canvas flap of the staging area tore open, catching a sharp gust of humid summer wind. Edward Mitchell stepped into the dim light of the enclosure. My father carried himself with the unearned swagger of a man who believed his mere presence commanded respect. The harsh overhead fluorescent bulbs illuminated the shiny synthetic lapels of his rented tuxedo. A flush of deep crimson crept up his neck, betraying the distinct influence of high-end bourbon. He paused, scanning the stacks of folded tables and discarded linens, until his bleary eyes locked directly onto my small corner. His heavy footsteps crunched against the temporary astroturf. He marched toward me, radiating an aura of unwarranted authority. He did not spare a single glance for the tall man in the bespoke suit sitting mere inches away from me. To Edward, anyone lingering in a service tent was invisible labor. Alexander Montgomery, the billionaire chief executive who held the fate of this entire property in his hands, was reduced to mere background scenery in my father's narrow worldview. The scent of expensive liquor mingled with a sharp trace of generic cologne as Edward stopped on the opposite side of the flimsy plastic table. He pointed a thick, rigid finger straight at my face. "What are you doing bothering the venue staff, Victoria?" he demanded, his voice a harsh, gravelly hiss intended to intimidate. "Your mother gave you specific instructions to stay out of sight." I kept my hands resting gently on my lap, concealing the glowing tablet beneath the white linen drape. "I am just getting some water," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Edward scoffed, shaking his head, with profound disappointment. "Nathan is inside finalizing a lucrative heavy machinery contract with serious investors tonight," he chided, leaning closer. "This is the most important evening of your brother's life, and you are an embarrassment. Look at yourself. You could not even find a decent dress to wear to a high society function. You are a walking liability to this family." Beside me, the air grew noticeably colder. Alexander shifted his weight. The relaxed posture of a curious observer vanished, replaced by the coiled tension of an apex predator. His dark eyes locked onto my father, glinting with lethal intent. The billionaire was accustomed to commanding boardrooms and dictating terms to global tycoons. Watching a middle-class man in a rented suit berate a woman who owned a vast real estate empire was a profound insult to his sensibilities. I saw the muscles in Alexander's jaw tighten as he prepared to stand up. He was a breath away from unleashing a verbal decimation that would shatter Edward's fragile ego into dust. I could not let that happen. The trap was not fully primed. If Alexander exposed my true identity right now, the shockwave would send Nathan scrambling for an exit before he signed the final catering escrow documents. I needed that physical signature to lock in the federal wire fraud charges. I reached out under the cover of the dim lighting and placed my hand gently on Alexander's forearm. I applied a firm, steady pressure. It was a silent, desperate command between two executives. "Hold your fire." Alexander glanced at my hand, then up to my face. He saw the cold, calculated strategy burning behind my eyes and slowly relaxed his stance, yielding to my silent directive. I lowered my chin, focusing my gaze onto the astroturf. I let my shoulders slump forward, channeling years of practiced submission. I resurrected the ghost of the socially awkward disappointment they raised me to be. "I am sorry, Dad," I murmured, forcing a slight tremor into my voice. "I will stay quiet. I promise I will not cause any trouble." Edward let out a derisive snort, fueled by his towering sense of superiority. He believed his harsh discipline had successfully cowed a rebellious subordinate. His chest puffed out, testing the limits of his tuxedo buttons. "See that you do," he instructed, adjusting his cuffs with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrists. "I am meeting the resort owner later this evening to discuss a private investment opportunity. I have a pitch that will revolutionize their supply chain. Try not to ruin it by wandering into the main hall looking like a vagrant." He turned on his heel and marched back toward the glowing exit. The canvas flaps swung shut behind him, sealing the humid air back inside the enclosure. He walked back to the dazzling reception, oblivious to the stark reality that he had just insulted the very chief executive holding the keys to his financial survival. Furthermore, he was boasting about a meeting with a mysterious resort owner who was currently drinking tap water from a paper cup right behind him. The heavy silence returned to our secluded corner, broken only by the distant hum of the jazz band. Alexander let out a low breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "How do you tolerate that level of profound ignorance?" he asked, his tone laced with genuine respect for my restraint. I was seconds away from having my security team escort him off the premises. "You never interrupt a fool while he is constructing his own gallows," I answered, lifting my encrypted tablet back onto the table. But his little speech just triggered a severe warning bell. My father does not have the liquid capital to pitch a major supply chain investment. He lives paycheck to paycheck, hiding behind credit card debt to maintain his country club membership. He is hiding something else. I tapped the glass screen, closing the security camera feed and opening a highly classified financial terminal. My elite corporate attorney, Vincent, had provided me with backdoor access to the state banking portals utilizing deep forensic software to monitor my family's financial footprint. I began running a detailed trace on Edward Mitchell personal accounts. If Nathan drained $300,000 from my grandfather's trust to pay for the floral arrangements and the caterers, I explained, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard, then he still needed capital to float his fake export business. Printing glossy brochures and leasing a luxury office space requires clean money. Where did he get it? The search algorithm hummed, loading rows of encrypted banking data. My eyes scanned the incoming ledger, focusing on a specific commercial lending institution based in Milwaukee. The numbers populated, and the minor domestic dispute of a stolen wedding budget morphed into a horrifying federal crime scene. My breath caught in my throat as the grim reality materialized on the high-resolution screen. "What is it?" Alexander asked, leaning in to read the glowing text. "Nathan did not just steal my inheritance," I whispered, tracing the red digits with my index finger. "The rot goes much deeper than I ever anticipated. He needed a guarantor for a massive commercial line of credit. His own credit score is a disaster due to unpaid luxury car leases. He needed someone with tangible assets to co-sign the loan." I opened the digitized loan agreement, viewing the scanned signatures at the bottom of the page. Edward and Caroline Mitchell had signed their names in stark black ink. "My parents bet their home on his fraudulent empire," I stated, the chilling truth echoing in the small space. To cover the remaining balances for his fake machinery exports, Nathan tricked our parents into co-signing a commercial loan. They used their primary Wisconsin residence, their only genuine asset, as collateral. Alexander studied the routing numbers, his sharp mind instantly calculating the legal ramifications. He transferred those funds across state lines to pay dummy vendors, Alexander noted. This is no longer a simple case of familial theft. He committed wire fraud. The stakes skyrocketed past the stratosphere. This was a highly coordinated syndicate of embezzlement. Nathan had weaponized his parents' blind adoration, leveraging their shelter to fund his grand illusion. Edward was not just an arrogant bystander barking orders in a rented tuxedo. He was legally complicit in bank fraud. If the fake export business defaulted, the bank would immediately seize the family home. I felt a cold, clinical calm wash over my mind. The emotion evaporated, leaving only raw, calculated strategy. I had already met with Vincent in a high-rise Milwaukee office 3 days ago. We mapped out the entire defensive perimeter. The asset freezes and federal indictments were already drafted, waiting for a judge's final signature. I was not using my tablet to initiate the law tonight. I was using it as a synchronized detonator. "I am simply waiting for Nathan to sign the final catering escrow document at the end of the reception," I explained to Alexander. "That signature is his final documented act of wire fraud. Once he executes that transfer, Vincent files the injunction. The local authorities are standing by." We sat in the dim light of the tent, the weight of the impending destruction settling around us. The jazz music from the ballroom swelled, reaching a joyful crescendo. They were dancing on a landmine, oblivious to the ticking timer. Before I could explain the next phase of the legal trap, the digital screen of my tablet flashed with an urgent incoming notification. The venue internal messaging system pinged a priority alert from the bridal suite. Melissa was issuing demands to the catering staff. Her text was rude, demanding, and impatient. "The bride is growing restless," Alexander observed, reading the alert. A faint smile touched my lips. I reached into the staff cooler beside my chair, pulling out a cheap bottle of sparkling cider. The trap was perfectly baited. The arrogant father had played his part flawlessly. Now it was time to draw the gold-digging bride out of her luxurious fortress and directly into the line of fire. Once the heavy canvas flaps settled back into place behind my father, the sweltering heat of the catering tent seemed to intensify. I exhaled a slow, measured breath, expelling the toxic residue of his presence. I directed my attention back to the glowing screen of my tablet. The momentary distraction provided by Edward had passed, leaving behind a chilling clarity. I initiated a deep forensic trace on the $300,000 Nathan had siphoned from my grandfather. The digital architecture of his crime began to populate across the display, unfolding like a venomous spider web. My grandfather had spent decades building his dairy farm legacy, waking before dawn to milk cows and repair heavy machinery in the freezing Wisconsin winters. He saved every penny to ensure our family possessed a tangible, secure future. Nathan had stolen that future with a few strokes of a forged pen. But as the data aggregated, filling the columns of my spreadsheet with bright red warning indicators, the minor conflict of a stolen wedding budget mutated into a catastrophic federal crime scene. Nathan had not just drained the generational trust. A luxury wedding of this magnitude combined with a fraudulent export business required a continuous, massive influx of capital. The $300,000 was merely a down payment on his towering illusion. I ran a secondary algorithm to uncover the origin of the remaining funds supporting his dummy corporations. The screen blinked, processing the complex financial routing before revealing a massive commercial line of credit originated from a premier bank in Milwaukee. I pulled up the digitized loan origination documents, and my blood turned to ice. The primary borrower was listed as Nathan Mitchell, but the guarantors were Caroline and Edward Mitchell. To cover the exorbitant remaining balances for his fake machinery exports, he had tricked our parents into co-signing a massive commercial loan. I zoomed in on the collateral section of the banking document. The address listed was unmistakable. It was the sprawling two-story colonial house in the Wisconsin suburbs where I grew up. My parents had literally bet their primary residence, their only genuine asset, on his fraudulent empire. Caroline and Edward were so blinded by their desperate need for high society status and their unwavering worship of their golden child that they willingly mortgaged their own shelter. They handed over the deed to their home to finance vintage champagne and imported caviar. They believed they were investing in the next great tech titan. Instead, they were funding an elaborate Ponzi scheme that was destined to leave them completely destitute. The psychological manipulation required to convince his own parents to risk their retirement for his vanity project was staggering. Alexander leaned over my shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the digitized financial contracts. His presence was a solid wall of corporate authority anchoring the gravity of the situation. He traced the movement of the funds across the screen, noting the specific offshore routing numbers Nathan used to launder the capital before bringing it back to pay the local Wisconsin vendors. He committed wire fraud across state lines, Alexander noted, his deep voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The billionaire hospitality magnate understood exactly what he was looking at. This was no longer a simple domestic dispute over a stolen inheritance. It was a highly coordinated syndicate of embezzlement. The stakes skyrocketed past familial betrayal directly into the realm of severe federal prosecution. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear for the parents who willingly sold their soul to elevate my abuser. I simply tapped the screen, saving the irrefutable evidence to my secure server. I had already anticipated this level of financial depravity. 3 days ago, I sat in a high-rise boardroom overlooking the icy shores of Lake Michigan, meeting with my elite corporate attorney, Vincent. Vincent was a legal shark, a man who dismantled fraudulent corporations with surgical precision. I handed him the initial evidence of the forged signatures and the stolen trust funds. We spent hours mapping out the exact trajectory of Nathan and his inevitable collapse. Vincent did not waste time sending cease and desist letters. He went straight to the federal prosecutors. The asset freezes and federal indictments were already prepared. A federal judge had reviewed the undeniable proof of the stolen generational wealth and the fraudulent commercial loans. The warrants were signed, sealed, and currently sitting in a secure briefcase, waiting for execution. I was not using my tablet to initiate the law tonight. My glowing screen was merely a synchronized detonator. I was monitoring the internal escrow accounts of the Lake Geneva Resort for one specific, highly anticipated transaction. Nathan had paid the initial deposit for this extravagant wedding using the stolen cash, but the venue required a final signature on the catering escrow document to release the remaining balance to the vendors. That final signature was the linchpin. The moment Nathan signed that digital document at the reception, he would officially authorize the transfer of stolen funds across state lines, utilizing the resort payment portal. It would be his final documented act of wire fraud, providing the federal investigators with a real-time verifiable crime. I was simply waiting for the ink to dry on his own death warrant. The jazz music swelling from the main ballroom sounded like a funeral dirge to my trained ears. My brother was dancing on a trapdoor, and I held the lever. Alexander watched my steady hands, his expression radiating profound respect for the absolute ruthlessness of my strategy. The heat inside the parking lot tent felt entirely disconnected from the cold calculation running through my mind. I reviewed the tactical timeline. Vincent was standing by. The local authorities were holding their position a few miles down the road, waiting for my signal. I watched the live security feed on my tablet, tracking Nathan as he mingled with the venture capitalists. He held a crystal flute of champagne, grinning with the arrogant certainty of a man who believed he had successfully outsmarted the world. He was completely oblivious to the digital crosshairs resting directly on his chest. Every boastful word he spoke to those wealthy investors was digging his grave inches deeper into the earth. I closed the primary banking application, ensuring the classified documents were safely hidden behind multiple layers of encryption. I needed to maintain the facade of the helpless, discarded sister just a little bit longer. Alexander leaned back in his plastic chair, mirroring my relaxed posture. We were two apex predators waiting in the tall grass. The sheer magnitude of the impending destruction was a heavy, intoxicating presence in the humid air. I looked toward the entrance of the tent, anticipating a brief moment of quiet before the final catering invoice was presented to the groom. I expected a few more minutes of isolated surveillance before the legal snare demanded my full attention. But the universe rarely adheres to a peaceful schedule. The heavy canvas flaps of the tent suddenly whipped open, catching a violent gust of wind. The rhythmic thumping of the live band grew momentarily deafening, before being muffled again as the flaps fell shut. A sharp, aggressive clicking of designer heels against the temporary flooring shattered the silence of our secluded corner. Before the ink could even dry on the federal warrants waiting in the wings, the superficial elegance of the wedding reception violently breached my perimeter. The fragile barrier separating my quiet observation post from the toxic reality of my family had been abruptly destroyed. Melissa and her bridal party had launched a direct attack, completely unaware that they were marching straight into a federal minefield. The heavy canvas flaps of the catering tent parted with a sharp rustle. A young woman draped in blush pink silk marched into the sweltering enclosure. She was one of the bridesmaids. Her face was flushed from the heat of the dance floor, and her high heels sank slightly into the temporary turf. She scanned the dim staging area with an expression of profound distaste. Her eyes bypassed the busy sous chefs and locked directly onto me, sitting in my plain navy dress. She did not see the tablet hidden beneath the table. She only saw a quiet woman she deemed beneath her social class. The bridesmaid closed the distance between us and snapped her manicured fingers inches from my face. The sharp cracking sound hung in the humid air. "Melissa wants the imported champagne, and she wants it now," the woman barked, her tone dripping with entitlement. "Do not just sit there lazy. Go to the reserve cooler and bring 3 bottles to the head table. The bride is waiting." A lesser person might have reacted to the blatant disrespect. A fragile ego might have stood up and shouted or demanded an apology for the degrading treatment. I did no such thing. My analytical mind simply cataloged the offense, filing it away as another piece of data in a long sequence of predictable human behavior. I recognized the opportunity presenting itself. I needed to draw the bride away from the safety of her high society audience. I needed her isolated from the flashing cameras and the fawning guests. I stood up smoothly, leaving my encrypted device concealed under the white linen tablecloth. I walked over to the industrial beverage cooler designated for the catering crew. I bypassed the locked wire cage holding the vintage French champagne that Nathan had purchased with my stolen inheritance. Instead, I reached deep into the icy water and pulled out a single bottle of cheap sparkling cider. The foil wrapper was peeling at the edges and the plastic cork looked incredibly generic. I wiped the excess condensation from the glass and handed it directly to the impatient bridesmaid. She did not bother to inspect the label. She snatched the cold bottle from my hand, muttering an insult under her breath about incompetent staff, before turning on her heel and marching back out into the muggy Wisconsin night. Alexander Montgomery shifted in his plastic chair across the table. He watched the exchange with a raised eyebrow, his sharp mind processing the deliberate sabotage. "You just handed a woman obsessed with luxury a $10 bottle of grocery store cider," he noted, his deep voice calm and observant. "She is going to view that as a declaration of war." "That is precisely the point," I replied, sitting back down and resting my hands on my lap. "Melissa operates on a strict currency of public perception. Her entire identity relies on projecting an image of flawless wealth to her peers. Handing her cheap cider in front of her elite guests is an intolerable insult to her fragile ego. It will force her out of the ballroom. She will not send a messenger this time. She will come here herself to deliver a reprimand." Alexander understood the tactical maneuver immediately. The billionaire chief executive stood up, his tall frame towering in the confined space. He took 3 deliberate steps backward, retreating into the unlit corner of the tent where the shadows swallowed him whole. He crossed his arms, blending perfectly into the darkness. He became a silent witness, preparing to observe the unraveling of a fraud. We waited. The jazz music from the reception drifted through the humid air, punctuated by the clinking of dishes being washed in the portable sinks behind us. I counted the seconds, mapping the exact time it would take for the bridesmaid to reach the head table, pour the drinks, and for the bitter taste of cheap apple cider to hit the bride's tongue. Exactly 3 minutes later, the tent flaps flew open with explosive force. Melissa stormed into the enclosure. She looked like a furious storm cloud wrapped in expensive white lace. Her custom designer gown, a garment that cost more than a standard vehicle, dragged carelessly across the stained artificial turf. The delicate hem soaked up spilled water and tracked mud as she marched forward, but she did not care. She was blinded by an overwhelming self-righteous fury. Her face was flushed a deep crimson beneath her professional makeup, and her dark eyes locked onto me with searing intensity. She clutched the offending bottle of sparkling cider in her left hand, holding it up like a piece of damning evidence. "What is wrong with you?" Melissa shrieked, her voice echoing off the canvas walls. The catering staff paused their frantic chopping and plating, turning their heads to watch the unfolding spectacle. Melissa did not care about the audience. She wanted to humiliate me. "Nathan is about to become a senior partner at an international export firm," she yelled, stepping so close I could smell the sharp scent of her designer perfume. "We are hosting the most influential venture capitalists in the state tonight, and you are trying to humiliate us by sending this garbage to my table? You are a spiteful, jealous little girl who cannot stand to see her brother succeed." I remained seated in my plastic chair, keeping my posture relaxed and my expression entirely blank. I did not flinch or offer a defense. I let her dig her own grave. Melissa was a woman who had built a hollow retail empire, selling overpriced fashion to suburban socialites. She maintained 3 failing boutiques by constantly opening new lines of credit and leveraging her future against her present desires. She viewed my quiet life, my unbranded clothing, and my lack of social media presence as proof of my inherent inferiority. She thought I was a peasant staring enviously at a queen. She had no idea she was screaming at the landlord who held the master leases for every single square foot of her retail space. "You could not just stay out of the way," Melissa continued, pacing in front of my table. "You had to cause a scene. You want to ruin this because you have nothing of your own. But it will not work, Victoria. We are untouchable. Do you have any idea the caliber of people sitting in that ballroom right now? We have secured the ultimate financial backing." She pointed a manicured finger vaguely toward the glowing lights of the main hall. Nathan has spent the entire evening negotiating with the primary investor, she boasted, her voice rising with desperate pride. The chief executive of this very hospitality group is backing my husband. He recognizes top-tier talent. In fact, he is so impressed with Nathan that he is personally gifting us a luxury penthouse in downtown Milwaukee as a wedding present. That is the kind of wealth we are dealing with while you sit in a parking lot drinking tap water. The air inside the tent went dead silent. The sous chef stopped moving, the rhythmic chopping of knives ceased. In the dark corner of the tent, the shadows shifted. Alexander stood perfectly still, but the sheer predatory tension radiating from his silhouette was palpable. His face was a mask of cold, unyielding fury. The billionaire had never spoken a single word to Nathan before tonight. He had certainly never promised an investment, and he definitely had not gifted a penthouse to a grifter pitching fake machinery exports. Melissa was standing in a sweltering tent, verbally committing fraud using the name and assets of a man standing less than 10 feet away from her. She was unknowingly bragging directly to the executioner. Melissa mistook my silence for submission. She thought her grand declaration of wealth had successfully crushed my spirit. She smiled a tight, victorious expression that failed to reach her eyes. She slammed the bottle of cider onto my plastic table. "You will stay out here until the reception is over," she commanded, adjusting the bodice of her ruined dress. "And tomorrow you will pack your bags and stop dragging your brother down. We are moving into a different stratosphere and you are no longer invited." I looked up at her, taking a slow, deliberate breath. The trap had closed. She had confessed her greed, broadcasted her fraudulent claims, and tied her entire identity to a man who had stolen my inheritance. She felt so secure in the legal protections of her high society marriage. She believed the paperwork she signed earlier that afternoon formed an impenetrable shield around her fragile boutique business. I let a razor-thin smile touch my lips. My hands slipped beneath the white linen tablecloth, resting my fingertips on the cool glass screen of my encrypted tablet. It was time to introduce her to the fine print. I prepared to ask her the single legal question that would shatter her illusion into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. "Did you read the prenuptial agreement Nathan had you sign, Melissa?" I asked. My voice remained terrifyingly calm, a stark contrast to her shrill accusations. Melissa threw her head back and scoffed. The heavy chandelier earrings she wore caught the dim overhead light, throwing sharp, fractured reflections across her flushed cheeks. "Of course I did," she snapped, her tone dripping with unearned superiority. "My lawyers drafted the primary framework. It is an ironclad contract. It explicitly protects my retail boutiques and my personal assets from your pathetic freeloading family. I made certain that when your brother married me, he was marrying my success, not granting you an open invitation to drain my bank accounts." Melissa prided herself on being a ruthless businesswoman. She constantly paraded her retail chain on social media as proof of her fierce independence. She viewed legal contracts as offensive weapons designed to keep perceived peasants like me safely locked outside her gated community. She never stopped to consider that a contract requires two honest parties to function. She assumed Nathan was a wealthy peer. She never investigated the foundation of his fabricated empire because his lies perfectly matched her own desperate ambitions. I kept my hands concealed beneath the white linen tablecloth. My fingers moved swiftly across the glass screen of my encrypted tablet. I navigated through the secure digital dossier my attorney Vincent had compiled. I selected a very specific, highly redacted legal file. I tapped the share icon, routing the document directly to a small portable wireless printer resting on a nearby catering desk used by the event coordinators to print updated seating charts and menu revisions. The sudden mechanical hum of the printer sliced through the heavy, humid air of the tent. The catering staff glanced over but quickly returned to washing dishes, wanting no part in the escalating drama. A single sheet of crisp white paper emerged from the output tray. I stood up, retrieved the printed page, and walked slowly back to my plastic chair. I slid the document across the cheap table until it stopped right next to the bottle of sparkling cider she had slammed down moments earlier. "You really should have read page 14, I stated smoothly, keeping my gaze locked onto her widening eyes. Melissa looked down. The document was a certified copy of the final prenuptial agreement, the exact version she and Nathan had signed and notarized just days before the ceremony. I had highlighted a dense block of obscure text buried deep within the liability indemnification section. Nathan took your drafted contract to his own cut-rate legal counsel for final revisions, I explained, my voice echoing with sterile clinical precision. You were so hyper-focused on shielding your boutiques from our parents that you skimmed right past the corporate liability clauses he inserted at the 11th hour. Melissa picked up the paper. Her manicured fingernails began to tremble as her eyes scanned the bold legal text. By signing that marriage certificate today, you did not just marry a man you believed to be a wealthy executive, I continued, ensuring every single syllable landed with devastating impact. You legally assumed joint and several liability for all of his existing and future corporate debts. The arrogant sneer that had defined her entire persona began to falter. The first deep fracture appeared in her flawless high society illusion. But Nathan does not have corporate debt, she stammered, her voice losing its shrill edge and dropping into a panicked, breathless whisper. He runs a highly profitable export firm. He told me the venture capital is already secured. He is a titan. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the plastic table. Nathan is a grifter who rents a strip mall office and prints glossy brochures, I corrected, watching the blood drain rapidly from her face. His entire export business is a hollow shell. The vintage champagne you are serving, the imported flowers decorating the ballroom, and the designer gown you are currently wearing were all purchased using stolen funds. He forged my signature to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars from a locked generational trust. To cover the remaining balances, he tricked our parents into leveraging their primary residence. Melissa stared at me, her jaws slackening. Her brain struggled to process the catastrophic legal jargon, translating it into her new grim reality. That means his wealth is actually a mountain of crippling, non-dischargeable federal debt, I stated, outlining her impending doom. The moment the state processes your marriage license, your retail boutiques are no longer protected assets. They become prime collateral. When the federal investigators freeze his bank accounts for interstate wire fraud tomorrow morning, they will seize your storefronts to cover the deficit. You demanded a shield, Melissa, but Nathan handed you an anchor and pushed you into the ocean. The physical toll of the revelation was immediate and brutal. The confident posture dissolved. Melissa swayed on her feet, looking as though the oxygen had been entirely sucked out of the sweltering tent. Her dark eyes darted wildly around the enclosure, searching for a hidden camera or some indication that this was an elaborate, cruel joke. But the dense legal text staring back at her was undeniable. The clauses were clear. She had legally bound herself to a sinking ship out of pure greed. The retail empire she spent years building on credit was about to be liquidated to pay for stolen ice sculptures. A low, agonizing breath escaped her lips. She opened her mouth, preparing to unleash a horrified scream that would undoubtedly pierce the thin canvas walls and alert the entire reception. But before the sound could materialize, her reckoning was abruptly intercepted. The heavy tent flaps were torn open with tremendous force. The sudden influx of cold night air did little to cool the boiling tension inside the enclosure. Caroline stomped into the staging area. The maternal facade she maintained so carefully in front of the country club elite had vanished entirely. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She looked nothing like the proud mother of the groom. She looked like a predator who had just found a pest infesting her pristine home. Flanking my mother were two towering men wearing matching tailored tuxedos. They were groomsmen, college fraternity brothers Nathan kept around to act as his personal muscle. Their faces were flushed with alcohol and misplaced loyalty. They cracked their knuckles, stepping heavily onto the artificial turf, scanning the room for the source of the disruption. Caroline ignored the trembling bride standing near the table. Her furious glare bypassed Melissa entirely and locked directly onto me. "You just could not stay out of sight," Caroline hissed, her voice dripping with profound disdain. "I gave you one simple instruction. Sit in the corner, keep your mouth shut, and do not ruin your brother's flawless evening. But you have to constantly humiliate us. You have to drag your pathetic failures into the light and poison his success." For decades, Caroline had utilized my quiet nature as a foil to highlight Nathan's supposed brilliance. She needed me to be the failure so her golden child could shine brighter by comparison. Seeing me engage with the bride disrupting the carefully curated narrative of the evening was an unforgivable offense in her eyes. She did not care what we were discussing. She only cared that the quiet daughter was stepping out of her designated invisible boundary. Caroline turned to the two burly groomsmen, pointing a sharp, trembling finger toward my plastic chair. "Grab her," Caroline ordered, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. "Confiscate whatever electronics she is playing with and throw her off the resort property immediately. If she tries to walk back into the venue, call the local authorities and have her arrested for trespassing." The two men stepped forward, their broad shoulders blocking the exit. They moved with the confident swagger of individuals who believed they held unchecked physical dominance over a helpless target. They assumed I was just a rogue relative causing a minor disturbance. They failed to realize they were advancing on the woman who owned the very ground beneath their expensive leather shoes. I sat perfectly still, watching the threat escalate. The stage was perfectly set for the shadows to finally shift. The larger of the two groomsmen lunged forward across the narrow space. His face was slick with perspiration and the distinct flush of an open bar. He reached out with thick, clumsy fingers aiming directly for my shoulders. He moved with the unearned confidence of a man who believed that physical intimidation was a valid currency. My mother stood just behind him, her eyes narrowed in fierce approval, waiting for me to be dragged out of the staging area like a common trespasser. For my entire childhood, Caroline had used the threat of physical displacement to maintain her toxic hierarchy. If I spoke out of turn, I was sent to my room. If I outshone my brother, I was sent to a relative house. Tonight, she intended to send me into the dark street to protect her fragile social illusion. I did not flinch or pull back. I remained seated in my wobbly plastic chair, my hands resting lightly near the edge of the table. I simply calculated the distance between his reaching hands and my arms, knowing that the dynamic of the entire evening was about to shift permanently. Before his fingers could graze the fabric of my navy dress, the dark corner of the tent shifted. The shadow seemed to part as a towering 6'4" silhouette stepped seamlessly into the harsh fluorescent light. Alexander Montgomery did not sprint or shout. He glided forward with the undeniable heavy gravity of an apex predator asserting dominance over his territory. He intercepted the airspace between the groomsmen and my chair, projecting a physical barrier made entirely of tailored charcoal wool and uncompromising authority. The sudden appearance of the billionaire chief executive stopped the groomsmen dead in their tracks. The larger man stumbled, attempting to halt his forward momentum, his heavy dress shoes skidding awkwardly against the temporary AstroTurf. He looked up at Alexander, his bravado faltering as he realized he was no longer dealing with a quiet outcast. He was standing face to face with a corporate titan whose mere presence commanded profound respect. Alexander did not raise his voice. True power never requires volume to be felt. He reached a steady hand into the interior pocket of his bespoke suit jacket. With a fluid, practiced motion, he withdrew a heavy, solid gold executive credential. He held it up, letting the harsh overhead bulbs catch the engraved crest of the hospitality conglomerate. The metal gleamed with a cold, blinding authority. If you lay a single hand on the majority shareholder of Great Lakes Hospitality, I will personally see to it that you are arrested for federal assault, Alexander stated. His voice was a low, lethal hum that vibrated through the humid air of the tent. It was not a warning, it was a certified promise. The two groomsmen froze, their eyes darting from the gleaming gold badge to Alexander's stern face. They were mid-level corporate climbers, desperate to network their way up the ladder. They recognized the crest. They recognized the man holding it. The legal threat paralyzed them. A federal assault charge initiated by a billionaire would not just result in handcuffs, it would obliterate their careers, empty their bank accounts, and ruin their lives before the sun came up. The larger groomsman slowly raised his hands in a gesture of total surrender, taking a cautious, shaky step backward. Behind them, Caroline stood, entirely immobilized. The venomous maternal rage that had contorted her features just seconds ago vanished. It was replaced by a profound, jarring cognitive dissonance. Her jaw literally unhinged, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. She stared at the towering executive, her mind struggling to process the impossible data presenting itself before her eyes. For the past hour, Caroline had been weaving through the opulent ballroom, sipping vintage champagne and boasting to wealthy investors. She had spent weeks memorizing the faces of the most influential venture capitalists in the state, hoping to secure Nathan a lucrative future. She knew exactly who Alexander Montgomery was. She had been desperately trying to secure an introduction to him all evening. Now, the very man she idolized as the pinnacle of high society was standing in a sweltering parking lot tent, actively shielding the daughter she had just ordered to be thrown off the property. Caroline looked from the gold badge in Alexander's hand down to the wobbly plastic chair where I sat. Her eyes widened as the sheer magnitude of his statement echoed in her ears. The majority shareholder. The words seemed to short-circuit her brain. She looked at my plain clearance rack dress, her gaze tracing the spilled tap water on my skirt. Her worldview relied on a strict visual hierarchy, where wealth was loud-branded and obvious. The concept that the owner of the sprawling luxury resort was sitting in the shadows, wearing sensible shoes, broke her fundamental understanding of reality. She took a ragged, shallow breath, her pearl necklace trembling against her collarbone. "Victoria," she stammered, her voice barely a hollow whisper. Her vocal cords could not push enough air to form a coherent sentence. She looked back at Alexander, seeking some indication that this was an elaborate, cruel joke. He offered her nothing but a gaze of unrelenting ice. A few feet away, the bride remained frozen near the catering cooler. Melissa was still clutching the printed prenuptial clause, her knuckles turning white. She watched the billionaire CEO defer to my authority, confirming everything the legal document had just threatened. The devastating truth crashed over her in a tidal wave. The quiet sister she had mocked, the woman she had demanded be kept out of her wedding photos, was not a freeloading relative. I was the landlord of her entire existence. The phantom billionaire who possessed the power to liquidate her boutique empire was sitting right in front of her. Melissa swayed on her designer heels, the opulent illusion of her bridal glory shattering into microscopic pieces. The urge to laugh, to revel in their staggering humiliation was a potent temptation. A lesser executive might have stood up and gloated, rubbing their faces in the dirt to avenge decades of emotional torment. But gloating is the currency of the insecure. I did not need to shout my victory to the heavens, because the structural integrity of my trap was already flawless. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch, allowing them to drown in their own profound realization. I turned my attention back to the table. I gently closed the cover of my encrypted tablet, the screen going pitch black. I slid the device into my leather tote bag, moving with slow, deliberate precision. I stood up from the cheap plastic chair. I reached down and smoothed the fabric of my navy dress. The inexpensive material rustled softly. I wore it like a suit of armor, proving that authentic power does not require a designer label to command a room. I stepped out from behind the folding table, closing the distance between myself and my mother. Caroline shrank backward, instinctively, terrified of the stranger standing in her daughter's shoes. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, searching panic. "Return to your seat, Mother," I instructed. My voice was even, devoid of any emotional tremor. It carried the crisp, undeniable tone of a chief executive officer dismissing a subordinate. I stripped away decades of quiet submission with a single sentence. "I am not the embarrassment you need to hide anymore." The two groomsmen did not wait for a second invitation. They turned and practically sprinted out of the staging area, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. They abandoned the bride and the mother of the groom, eager to fade back into the anonymous crowd of the reception. Caroline swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she gripped the fabric of her evening gown. She looked at Melissa, who was staring at the floor, trapped in a state of catatonic shock. Caroline backed away, her designer heels catching awkwardly on the synthetic turf. She stumbled through the canvas flaps, fleeing the suffocating heat of the tent and retreating toward the deceptive safety of the grand ballroom. I looked at Alexander, who offered a subtle nod of profound respect. The transition of power was complete. I walked toward the exit, feeling the cool evening breeze slipping through the canvas opening. From the main venue, the muffled sound of a spoon tapping against a crystal glass drifted into the night air. The jazz band ceased playing. The dull roar of the high society crowd tapered off into a hushed, anticipatory murmur. The timing was an absolute masterpiece. The best man is about to finish his speech, I said, glancing toward the glowing lights of the reception hall. The false coronation was reaching its peak. My brother was preparing to take the microphone to boast about a kingdom built entirely on stolen foundations and forged signatures. The audience was primed for a story of self-made triumph. I adjusted the strap of my bag, feeling a cold thrill settle deep into my bones. "The main event is finally beginning," I murmured, stepping out into the crisp Wisconsin night, ready to deliver a reality check they would never forget. Walking out of the sweltering canvas enclosure, the crisp evening air of Lake Geneva washed over my face, providing an instant grounding relief. The stifling humidity of the parking lot vanished, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of deep, fresh water and towering pine trees. My lungs expanded, taking in the cool breeze. Alexander walked perfectly in step beside me. He did not rush, nor did he linger. His stride was measured, projecting a quiet, lethal confidence. His bespoke suit caught the faint illumination from the resort pathways. Having a billionaire hospitality magnate flanking my right side acted as an unspoken validation of my authority. Anyone who dared to glance our way would instantly recognize that the woman in the clearance rack navy dress was not a stray guest. She was the apex predator preparing to strike. As we navigated the manicured flagstone path toward the grand ballroom, my phone vibrated sharply against my hip. I pulled the device from my pocket, shielding the glowing screen with my palm. It was a secure text message from my corporate attorney, Vincent. The brief notification read that local Wisconsin law enforcement units were holding their position exactly 2 miles down the main highway. The cruisers were parked out of sight, waiting for my explicit green light. The tension ratcheted up another notch. The legal snare was fully primed. I was no longer merely orchestrating a social humiliation. I was coordinating a tactical police raid. My brother had mere minutes left as a free man before the handcuffs closed around his wrists. The countdown had transitioned from a distant threat to an imminent reality. We stopped just outside the towering glass doors of the reception hall. The sheer scale of the event was staggering. Inside the opulent space, 300 elite investors, venture capitalists, and high society socialites mingled under sprawling crystal chandeliers. Waiters glided through the crowd with silver trays, refilling flutes with vintage champagne that my stolen inheritance had funded. I watched through the pane as the best man tapped a silver spoon against his glass, requesting the attention of the room. The ambient chatter dialed down to a hushed murmur. The groomsman, visibly swaying from the open bar, launched into a generic, alcohol-fueled tribute. He recounted exaggerated college stories, painting my brother as a visionary leader destined for greatness. The wealthy audience chuckled politely, drinking the fabricated narrative straight from the tap. The applause rippled across the room as the best man finished his rambling toast. Nathan stepped up to the center podium, adjusting the lapels of his custom tuxedo with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrists. He leaned into the microphone, flashing his signature blinding smile. My brother possessed a terrifying talent for weaving fiction into compelling reality. He launched into a sickeningly boastful monologue about self-made wealth. He spoke passionately about pulling himself up by his bootstraps, conquering the complex Wisconsin heavy machinery sector through sheer grit and unmatched business acumen. Listening to his lies from the shadows, a cold realization settled in my chest. Nathan despised hard labor. Growing up, he refused to set foot on our grandfather's dairy farms, mocking the dirt and the diesel fuel. He preferred leased luxury sedans and empty executive titles, always seeking the shortest path to unearned prestige. Now, he was standing before titans of industry, claiming to be a blue-collar hero who built an export empire with his bare hands. Nathan dramatically paused, letting his gaze sweep over the captivated audience. He raised a hand, gesturing toward the VIP table near the front of the stage. He loudly praised our parents, Caroline and Edward, calling them the unwavering bedrock of his success. He thanked them for their endless sacrifices, detailing how they shaped his brilliant entrepreneurial spirit. He painted a picture of a flawless, closely knit family unit, entirely omitting my existence. To the 300 guests sitting in that room, the groom was an only child. I was erased from the family history, just as I had been erased from the wedding photos and the rehearsal dinner. My parents beamed with pride from their seats, raising their glasses to their golden boy. They basked in the reflected glory of his fake achievements, blissfully ignorant that their primary residence was currently acting as collateral for his criminal enterprise. Alexander glanced down at me, his jaw set in a firm, unyielding line. The time for passive observation was over. The billionaire raised his hand, catching the attention of the lead audiovisual technician stationed at a sprawling mixing board near the rear exit. Alexander had personally hired the elite production crew for this venue, ensuring unparalleled loyalty from the staff. The technician noticed his employer's signal and immediately removed his headphones. Alexander pointed subtly toward a specific piece of equipment on the secondary control rack. The sound engineer nodded, understanding the silent directive without hesitation. He unclipped a sleek, wireless master override microphone from the charging dock, stepped away from his station, and walked swiftly toward the glass doors, where we stood waiting in the cool night breeze. The technician pushed the door open just a crack, slipping the heavy black microphone into my waiting hand. He offered a quick, respectful bow to Alexander before returning to his mixing board. The metal cylinder felt cold and substantial against my palm. This small device was the key to bypassing the entire acoustic infrastructure of the grand ballroom. It held the power to cut the feed to Nathan's podium and hijack the surround sound speakers mounted in every corner of the extravagant space. I gripped the handle, feeling a surge of pure electric adrenaline coursing through my veins. The years of silent submission, the decades of being treated as a worthless afterthought, coalesced into this singular defining moment. I was holding the pin to the grenade. Inside the hall, Nathan reached the grand finale of his fabricated origin story. He lifted his crystal flute high into the air, offering a toast to his new bride, to his wealthy investors, and to an unstoppable legacy of prosperity. The audience murmured in agreement, raising their own glasses in a synchronized display of upper-class camaraderie. I stepped slightly forward, pushing the heavy glass door open just enough to let my voice carry into the room, while remaining cloaked in the dim lighting of the terrace. I lifted the master override microphone to my lips. My thumb found the small toggle switch on the side of the handle. I pushed it upward. A faint, nearly imperceptible electronic click signaled that the connection was live. I bypassed his feed, seizing total control of the auditory environment. As Nathan parted his lips to deliver his final, triumphant cheer, I spoke. My tone did not shake. It carried no anger, no sorrow, and no hesitation. It resonated with terrifying, crystal-clear authority, booming from the ceiling speakers and vibrating through the polished hardwood floors. A self-made legacy built entirely on a forged signature, Nathan. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The booming projection of my voice sliced through the celebratory atmosphere like a scythe. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. 300 heads whipped around in frantic confusion, scanning the room to find the source of the disembodied voice. The elegant clinking of vintage crystal ceased immediately, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence. At the center podium, Nathan froze. The triumphant smile shattered, melting off his face as the color drained rapidly from his cheeks. His raised arm trembled, causing the champagne in his glass to slosh precariously over the rim. He recognized the tone. He knew exactly who had just hijacked his crowning achievement. The high society guests stared in bewilderment, the pristine illusion of the evening fractured beyond repair. The grand facade had cracked, and the undeniable truth was preparing to flood the room. I pushed the heavy glass doors open, leaving the cool night air behind. The transition from the shadowy terrace into the blinding illumination of the grand ballroom was jarring, but I did not blink. I stepped onto the polished marble floor. The crowd of 300 elite guests parted instantly, creating a wide, unobstructed path down the center aisle. I wore no diamonds, my neck was bare, and my navy dress remained stained with tap water from the staging area, yet my posture radiated a sovereign, untouchable authority. Alexander Montgomery walked half a step behind my right shoulder. The visual hierarchy was undeniable. The billionaire chief executive, a man these venture capitalists had spent the entire evening desperately trying to court, was deferring to the woman in the clearance rack dress. His presence alone validated my standing in a room obsessed with net worth and corporate pedigree. Near the front of the room, sitting at the VIP family table, Caroline stared at my approach. The maternal venom she had wielded in the catering tent evaporated, replaced by profound, paralyzing shock. Her manicured hands flew to her chest, clutching her pearl necklace as if struggling to draw breath. She watched the towering hospitality magnate escort the daughter she had deemed unpresentable. The cognitive dissonance fractured her reality. Her knees buckled. She sank heavily into her gold-gilded chair, her designer gown bunching awkwardly around her legs. For decades, she had curated an image of flawless suburban superiority, hiding me away to protect her fragile social standing. Now she was forced to watch her discarded child command the very room she had worked so hard to infiltrate. Her carefully constructed universe was breaking apart at the seams, leaving her gasping for air amidst the wreckage. I continued my steady march toward the head table. The venture capitalists and industry titans lining the aisle were not fools. They possessed sharp, analytical minds trained to read shifting power dynamics. They recognized Alexander. They saw his protective stance and the unmistakable respect in his eyes as he guided me forward. Whispers ignited near the back of the hall, spreading like a wildfire through dry brush. The rumors of Great Lakes Hospitality being acquired by an anonymous blind trust 3 years ago were well known in their elite circles. The identity of the phantom owner had been the subject of endless corporate speculation. As the puzzle pieces slammed together, the hushed murmurs mutated into audible gasps. They realized the unassuming woman walking past their tables held the keys to the entire resort conglomerate. They quickly set their drinks down, adjusting their ties and recalculating their allegiances on the fly. I reached the edge of the elevated stage and ascended the short wooden steps. The polished planks echoed softly beneath my sensible shoes. Nathan stood frozen at the center podium. His charismatic facade had disintegrated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. His hands trembled with such intense force that the vintage champagne remaining in his crystal flute sloshed over the rim. The expensive liquid splashed directly onto his custom leather shoes, soaking into the polished material. He did not even notice the ruin of his wardrobe. His wide, bloodshot eyes were locked onto my face, desperately searching for the meek, obedient sister he had bullied his entire life. That submissive girl was gone, eradicated by years of silent calculation and relentless hard work. In her place stood his executioner. I brought the wireless override microphone back to my lips. The room fell so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents and the shallow breathing of the wedding party. "You banished me to a parking lot so I would not ruin your image," I announced, projecting my voice to the hundreds of captivated guests. My tone was surgical, stripped of any lingering familial emotion. It carried the crisp, undeniable resonance of an executive holding a stacked deck. But it is incredibly difficult to maintain an image when you are trespassing on property owned by the woman you just exiled. The word trespassing struck the room with the force of a physical blow. The silence shattered. Shouts of disbelief erupted from the investor tables. Men who had just written substantial seed capital checks for his fake export firm began pulling out their phones, ready to cancel their transfers. The illusion of Nathan's self-made wealth incinerated in front of the very audience he needed to sustain it. He was not a rising titan of industry. He was a fraud, standing on a stage he did not own, drinking wine he could not afford. The high society peers he sought to impress were now looking at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. The social currency he valued above all else plummeted to zero in a matter of seconds. Panic is a primal instinct. Nathan realized his kingdom was evaporating into the humid Wisconsin night. He acted on sheer, desperate impulse. Letting his ruined champagne flute drop to the floor, where it shattered into a dozen pieces, he lunged forward. His hands reached out wildly, attempting to snatch the microphone from my grasp, to somehow silence the broadcast and salvage whatever dignity remained. He wanted to regain control of the narrative, to spin a desperate lie and pacify his furious investors. His breath hitched in a pathetic, whining gasp as he closed the distance between us, hoping to use physical intimidation to assert dominance one last time. Before his reaching fingers could even graze the plastic casing of the microphone, Alexander moved. The hospitality magnate stepped smoothly and decisively into the gap, placing his large frame directly between my brother and me. Alexander did not raise his hands or adopt a fighting stance. He simply delivered a cold, silent stare that carried the weight of a dozen legal threats. The unyielding glare paralyzed Nathan in his tracks. My brother shrank back, his bravado crushed by the imposing presence of a man who dealt with actual predators daily. Alexander did not need to speak a single word to communicate that any further physical aggression would result in severe, permanent consequences. Down at the family table, Edward sat motionless. His earlier boasting about meeting the resort owner hung over him like a dark, ominous cloud. The man who had stormed into the catering tent to berate me for bothering the staff was now staring at the ceiling, struggling to process his own impending ruin. He had co-signed the fraudulent loans, believing his son was a genius. Seeing his son cower before Alexander while the entire room turned against them confirmed his worst fears. The Mitchell family name, which he guarded so fiercely, was now synonymous with deception. The country club friends sitting nearby shifted their chairs away, creating a physical barrier of isolation around my parents. The social execution was officially complete. The Golden Boy had been stripped of his armor, exposed as a pathetic grifter before the highest echelon of local society. The guests were whispering, pointing, and distancing themselves from the head table. But social humiliation was merely the appetizer in this carefully crafted menu of retribution. The real consequence of his arrogance required a much deeper cut. I lowered the microphone, sliding my free hand into my pocket to retrieve my encrypted tablet. It was time to show the venture capitalists exactly how he funded his fake empire, initiating a financial obliteration they would never forget. I stood victorious on the elevated stage, holding the digital device that would seal my brother's fate. My thumb hovered over the smooth glass surface of the encrypted tablet. The ballroom remained trapped in a suffocating hush. Hundreds of guests held their collective breath, waiting for my next move. I tapped the final execution command. The reckoning was silent, but the results were instantaneous. High above the head table, 3 towering projector screens hung suspended from the vaulted ceiling. Just seconds prior, those displays had been cycling through a curated slideshow of romantic engagement photographs, showing Nathan and Melissa smiling on sandy beaches and posing in front of rented sports cars. That fabricated fairy tale flickered briefly before plunging into pitch-black darkness. An instant later, the monitors flared back to life, bathing the room in a harsh, clinical white light. A collective murmur rippled through the audience as they shielded their eyes from the sudden brightness. Replacing the manufactured romance were rows of dense, highly redacted bank ledgers. I had spent countless nights mapping this precise flow of stolen capital, ensuring every digit aligned with irrefutable proof. Bright crimson digital arrows materialized on the displays, cutting across the spreadsheets to trace the origin of the funds. The graphic highlighted a specific account routing number linked directly to my late grandfather. He spent 50 years waking up before dawn tending to his dairy herds near the freezing Great Lakes coastline to build that generational wealth. He saved every penny to guarantee a secure future for our lineage. The red arrows traced the theft of $300,000, drained straight from that sacred trust. The path of the stolen money snaked across the projection screen, splitting into 2 distinct directions. One arrow pointed toward the escrow accounts of the very caterers currently serving vintage wine to the attendees. The other arrow zigzagged downward, illuminating a series of offshore shell companies registered in notorious tax havens. I raised the wireless microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the high-fidelity speakers, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers with surgical precision. "You did not just steal a wedding," I declared, watching the color drain from my brother's face. "You orchestrated an interstate financial heist. Those offshore routing numbers confirm you funneled stolen trust funds across state boundaries to avoid detection. You committed federal wire fraud to pay for your ice sculptures and imported orchids." The crowd stared in morbid fascination at the visual evidence of his crimes. The red lines on the screens told a story of unbridled greed and spectacular incompetence. The sheer scale of the deception left the high society attendees paralyzed in their velvet chairs. But the revelation of the stolen wedding budget was only the first layer of his deception. I swiped my finger across the tablet, transitioning the projection to a new set of documents. A scanned copy of a commercial loan agreement appeared magnified for every single investor to scrutinize. The primary borrower listed was Nathan Mitchell. However, the secondary guarantor signatures at the bottom of the page belonged to our parents. To fund your imaginary export empire, you required a substantial line of credit, I continued, my tone steady and unyielding. Since your personal credit is ruined by unpaid leases, you needed collateral. You convinced our parents to leverage their primary residence to guarantee your fake loans. They bet the roof over their heads on a ghost company. Down at the VIP family table, Edward reacted to the public exposure of his darkest secret. My father turned an unnatural, ghastly shade of gray. His jaw slacked, and his hands began to tremble so fiercely that his silverware rattled against his china plate. The illusion of his upper-class status evaporated in front of his wealthy country club peers. The realization of his impending bankruptcy was no longer a private nightmare discussed in hushed tones behind closed doors. It was now public knowledge, broadcasted on 30-foot screens. The friends who had praised his success moments ago now averted their gazes, shifting their chairs away, as if his financial ruin were a contagious disease. Caroline sat frozen beside him, her carefully styled hair seeming to wilt under the oppressive weight of the moment. She had banished me to a sweltering parking lot tent, claiming my presence would ruin their pristine image. Now the very foundation of her secure suburban life was unraveling for all her esteemed guests to witness. She stared at the projection displaying her own forged signature, her chest heaving as the oxygen seemingly vanished from the room. She traded her only genuine asset to finance a mirage, and the bill had finally come due. The ripple effect of the revelation struck the venture capitalists sitting in the center of the room. These were seasoned professionals who guarded their portfolios with ruthless efficiency. Seeing the indisputable evidence of a Ponzi scheme unraveling before their eyes triggered a wave of swift self-preservation. Men and women in tailored suits abruptly abandoned their half-eaten meals. They pulled out their mobile phones, their screens illuminating their tense faces in the dim ballroom lighting. They frantically dialed their brokers, speaking in urgent, hushed tones to halt any pending investments in Nathan's dummy firm. The lucrative seed capital my brother had spent months courting vanished into the ether within a matter of minutes. The atmosphere in the room shifted from a festive celebration into a sprawling crime scene. The minor domestic conflict of sibling rivalry had officially mutated into a multi-million-dollar federal investigation. I watched the industry titans sever their ties, recognizing that anyone associated with the groom would soon face grueling audits from government regulators. They retreated toward the exits, eager to escape the blast radius of his collapsing house of cards. The jazz band had long since fled the stage, leaving only the low, frantic hum of panicked conversations filling the void. Nathan was thoroughly cornered. He stood near the edge of the stage, trapped under the unforgiving glare of the overhead lights. Sweat beaded heavily on his forehead, rolling down his cheeks to soak the stiff collar of his white dress shirt. His chest heaved in rapid, shallow gasps as he struggled to draw oxygen into his panicking lungs. The entire network of lies he had meticulously woven over the past year burned to ash right in front of him. He looked out at the sea of disgusted faces, searching for a single sympathetic eye, but found only judgment and revulsion. He had built his entire identity on the perception of dominance and elite capability. By stripping away his false achievements, I left him naked before the tribunal of high society. He opened his mouth attempting to formulate a cohesive defense, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. The undeniable truth projected behind him silenced any further deception. The intricate web of shell companies and forged signatures was too complex to explain away as a simple misunderstanding. He had dug a hole so deep that the sunlight of his former life could no longer reach him. Alexander remained steadfast by my side, a silent sentinel, reinforcing the gravity of the situation. The hospitality chief executive watched the chaotic unraveling with a profound sense of justice. He understood the necessity of excising cancerous elements from the business world. My brother thought he could manipulate the titans of industry using a rented tuxedo and a stolen inheritance. He failed to comprehend that true power is derived from authentic substance and relentless diligence. The dairy farm work ethic my grandfather instilled in me had quietly outmaneuvered his flashy suburban grift. As the reality of his impending incarceration settled over the stage, Nathan slowly turned his head toward the altar. His desperate gaze sought the one person who was legally bound to stand by his side. Melissa stood frozen near the floral archway, her opulent designer gown pooling around her feet. The bridal veil she wore seemed to weigh heavily upon her pristine hair. She had demanded a life of luxury and prestige, pushing my brother to fund her extravagant boutique lifestyle by any means necessary. She viewed herself as a shrewd entrepreneur, navigating the upper echelons of corporate wealth. But as she stared up at the illuminated bank ledgers detailing the catastrophic debt she was about to inherit, the foundation of her own ambition began to fracture. The tension shifted from my brother's public execution toward the bride preparing the ground for a horrific realization that would sever their union before it truly began. Melissa stood perfectly rigid beneath the cascading floral archway. Her custom designer gown, constructed from layers of imported Italian silk and hand-sewn lace, suddenly weighed heavily upon her shoulders. Minutes ago, it was the ultimate symbol of her triumphant ascension into the upper echelons of high society. Now it felt like a tailored prison uniform, suffocating her every breath. She stared up at the towering projection screens illuminating the dim ballroom. The glaring red digital arrows tracing the stolen trust funds reflected vividly in her dark eyes. The ambient noise of the room faded into a dull, rushing hum in her ears as her mind struggled to process the staggering financial data displaying before her. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of effortless prosperity. She clawed her way up from modest beginnings to open a chain of suburban fashion boutiques, relying heavily on revolving credit and the perception of success to secure new investors. She viewed marriage not as a romantic partnership, but as a strategic corporate merger. When she met my brother, she saw a golden ticket. She saw leased luxury vehicles, expensive tailored suits, and a man who promised her a life free from the crushing stress of impending debt. She tolerated my parents and their haughty attitudes because she believed they were the gatekeepers to a vast, legitimate fortune. She had demanded a rock-solid prenuptial agreement to protect her fragile retail empire from us, assuming we were the parasites. Her hands began to tremble. She looked down at the small, crumpled piece of paper she had hastily shoved into a hidden pocket of her dress while fleeing the catering tent. It was the printed indemnification clause I had slid across the plastic table. She slowly pulled the paper out her manicured fingers, smoothing the creases. The dense legal jargon stared back at her, confirming every single terrifying detail projected on the screens above. By signing the ceremonial marriage license earlier that afternoon, she had positioned herself on the edge of a cliff. If she allowed the state to finalize the union tonight, she would legally absorb his monumental, non-dischargeable federal debt. The federal agents currently mobilizing to freeze his assets would not stop at his fraudulent export firm. They would sweep through her boutique accounts, liquidating her inventory and padlocking her storefronts to satisfy his towering liabilities. The romantic illusion of a wealthy future shattered into a million jagged pieces scattering across the polished marble floor. Melissa was not experiencing the heartbreak of a betrayed lover. She was experiencing the pure, unadulterated terror of a cornered business owner watching her entire life burn to ash. Her survival instinct, honed by years of cutthroat retail management, kicked into overdrive. She realized this was no temporary social embarrassment that could be smoothed over with a clever public relations spin. If she stayed on that stage for one more minute, she would be dragged down into the federal abyss right alongside him. Melissa reached up and grabbed the edge of her diamond-encrusted veil. With a fierce, frantic pull, she ripped the delicate tulle from her meticulously styled hair. The expensive hairpins scattered across the stage, peeing sharply against the wooden planks. She threw the veil onto the floor, treating the luxurious fabric like toxic waste. She turned her entire body to face Nathan. My brother was still sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he stared at the damning bank ledgers. He sensed her movement and turned toward her, extending his shaking hands in a desperate plea for solidarity. He needed her to stand by his side to project a united front to the skeptical investors watching their every move. He opened his mouth, stammering a pathetic defense about bridge loans and temporary cash flow issues. He took a hesitant step toward her, reaching out to grasp her waist. "You lied to me," Melissa screamed, her voice cracking over the microphone feedback echoing through the cavernous hall. Her tone carried no sorrow, only a profound, piercing rage. Before his fingers could graze her silk bodice, Melissa swung her right arm with devastating force. The palm of her hand connected directly with his cheek. The resounding crack echoed like a gunshot through the silent ballroom. The impact snapped his head to the side, leaving a bright crimson handprint blossoming across his pale skin. The sheer velocity of the strike sent a shockwave through the elite crowd, prompting several front-row guests to physically recoil in their velvet chairs. Nathan staggered backward, clutching his stinging face, his eyes wide with disbelief. Melissa did not pause to let him recover. She grabbed her left hand and forcefully twisted the flawless diamond engagement ring off her finger. The stone, purchased with the very trust funds he had siphoned from my inheritance, caught the harsh glare of the projectors. She held the heavy piece of jewelry in her palm for a fraction of a second, her upper lip curling into a sneer of profound revulsion. She then pivoted away from the groom, locking her furious gaze onto the VIP family table. Caroline sat frozen in her gilded chair, her face a mask of pale horror as she watched her golden child suffer a public execution. My mother had spent months treating Melissa like a prized acquisition, boasting to her country club friends about the elite pedigree her son had secured. Melissa raised her arm and hurled the heavy diamond ring directly at my mother. The piece of jewelry flew through the air, striking Caroline squarely on the collarbone before deflecting off her pearl necklace and clattering onto the hardwood floor. Caroline gasped, clutching her chest, her eyes wide with shock at the blatant physical disrespect. "Keep your fake wealth and your criminal family," Melissa spat, her voice ringing out with a lethal clarity that required no microphone. She did not wait for a response from the stunned matriarch. Melissa bent down, gathering the heavy layers of her silk skirts into her fists to prevent them from tripping her. She turned her back on the altar, the floral arrangements, and the man she had promised to love forever. She marched straight down the center aisle, her posture rigid, with an intense, burning determination to escape the blast radius of his collapsing empire. It was not moral superiority driving her footsteps. It was absolute, unadulterated panic. The high society guests who just an hour ago had raised their vintage crystal flutes to toast the happy couple now scrambled to get out of her way. They pulled their chairs inward, parting like the Red Sea to afford the fleeing bride a wide, unobstructed path. They watched in morbid fascination, their eyes tracking her every step as she navigated the gauntlet of judgment. Nobody offered a comforting word. Nobody reached out to stop her. They recognized that her departure was a calculated retreat. She was running for her financial life. Melissa reached the heavy double doors at the rear of the ballroom. She pushed through the brass handles with a final, forceful shove, disappearing into the cool night air. The doors swung shut behind her, sealing the quiet tension back inside the opulent hall. The departure of the bride severed the last remaining thread supporting Nathan's fractured reality. The illusion of a successful merger, a wealthy future, and a pristine social standing vanished entirely with the rustle of her exiting gown. He stood alone on the elevated stage, isolated under the unforgiving glare of the overhead lights. The venture capitalists he had spent the evening courting were now whispering urgently to one another, pointing at the financial ledgers still scrolling relentlessly across the towering screens. His knees buckled, the tailored tuxedo pants bunched awkwardly as he collapsed onto the hardwood stage. He hit the floor with a dull thud, burying his face in his hands. The confident, arrogant tech titan dissolved into a pathetic, hollow shell. He wept openly, his shoulders shaking with loud, miserable sobs that echoed faintly through the silent room. He had spent his entire life coasting on unearned privilege, shielded by parents who enabled his every deception. Now, stripped of his stolen capital and abandoned by his opportunistic bride, he possessed nothing but the crushing weight of his impending ruin. I stood near the edge of the stage, observing his total degradation with a cold, surgical detachment. Alexander remained silent beside me, his formidable presence a steadfast testament to the changing of the guard. The social destruction was flawlessly executed, but a public humiliation was only a temporary wound. To ensure a permanent erasure of his toxic influence, a legal mechanism was required. A distant sound began to pierce the quiet night, growing steadily louder as it approached the resort gates. The tears streaming down my brother's face were about to meet a much harsher reality, because the true consequences of federal wire fraud do not arrive wearing silk gowns. They arrive wearing badges. The low, rhythmic sobbing of the groom provided a pathetic soundtrack to the ruined reception. Nathan knelt on the polished hardwood stage, a crumpled heap of tailored wool and shattered pride. Above him, the towering projector screens continued their silent, damning broadcast of his fraudulent bank ledgers. The elite guests remained frozen in their velvet chairs, too stunned to murmur, too captivated by the sheer scale of the disaster to look away. Through the tall, frosted windows of the Lake Geneva resort, a new illumination pierced the muggy summer night. Slicing through the darkness, alternating flashes of crimson and cobalt blue painted the glass panes. The distant wail of sirens, previously a faint hum on the highway, rapidly intensified into an undeniable roar. The authorities were not just approaching, they had arrived. The heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding thud. The polished brass handles struck the paneled walls, announcing the arrival of the final reckoning. My elite corporate attorney, Vincent, stepped over the threshold. Vincent possessed a reputation that made opposing counsel sweat through their silk ties. A former federal prosecutor who transitioned into private wealth defense, he viewed legal loopholes not as clever tactics, but as personal insults requiring swift eradication. He walked with a measured, predatory cadence, his dark trench coat catching the ambient light. Flanking Vincent were 6 uniformed Wisconsin law enforcement officers. The heavy clatter of their tactical boots and utility belts echoed against the marble entryway, drowning out the last fading notes of the jazz band's abandoned instruments. The high society attendees instinctively recoiled, pulling their chairs closer to their respective tables. Venture capitalists, men and women who navigated hostile takeovers daily, recognized the unyielding posture of a coordinated police raid. They cleared a wide, unobstructed path down the center aisle, eager to distance themselves from the blast radius. This entrance was the culmination of a trap I laid weeks prior, relying on one specific, inescapable trigger. Nathan thought he was playing the role of a generous host when he pulled out his expensive fountain pen minutes before his best man toast. He signed the final catering escrow release, a document authorizing the transfer of the stolen trust funds to a vendor based across state lines in Illinois. By executing that single transaction during the reception, he handed the investigators a real-time, undeniable instance of interstate wire fraud. It was the firing of the ultimate, inescapable weapon. Vincent waited in his vehicle exactly 2 miles away, monitoring the digital escrow portal. The moment my brother's signature cleared the system, Vincent signaled the waiting cruisers. Vincent reached the elevated stage, bypassing the scattered remnants of Melissa's discarded veil. He approached the head table where Nathan remained kneeling, his face buried in his hands. The attorney unlatched his leather briefcase, extracting a thick stack of certified legal documents bound by heavy binder clips. He dropped the paperwork directly onto the table. The heavy bundle landed with a wet smack right in the center of a puddle of spilled vintage champagne. The amber liquid seeped into the edges of the thick parchment, but the embossed seals of the federal court remained pristine and glaring. "Nathan Mitchell," Vincent declared, his deep voice booming with undeniable legal finality, requiring no microphone to command the cavernous hall. "Your corporate accounts are officially frozen by federal mandate. Every routing number, shell company, and hidden asset tied to your name is now under the direct jurisdiction of the United States government." Nathan flinched as if struck by a physical blow. He slowly lowered his hands, revealing a face streaked with tears and smeared sweat. He stared at the thick stack of papers soaking up the expensive alcohol, his mind struggling to comprehend the rapid evaporation of his empire. Vincent did not offer a moment of reprieve. He pulled a secondary folder from his briefcase, flipping it open to display a foreclosure notice. "Furthermore," Vincent continued, his tone devoid of an ounce of sympathy, "the luxury estate you leased in Milwaukee has been foreclosed upon. The locks were changed as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. You no longer possess a residence, a company, or a single accessible dollar." The venture capitalists in the audience exchanged grim, knowing glances. The penthouse Melissa had boasted about just an hour ago was merely another illusion built on shifting sand. The groom was a phantom, and his kingdom had just dissolved into dust. The lead police officer stepped onto the wooden planks of the stage, signaling two of his deputies to flank the kneeling groom. They did not handle him with the delicate deference typically afforded to wealthy resort guests. They grabbed Nathan by his upper arms, hauling his dead weight off the floor. The seams of his custom tuxedo jacket strained under the sudden, forceful upward pull. "Put your hands behind your back," the officer instructed, spinning Nathan around. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of cold iron handcuffs clicking shut pierced the breathless silence of the ballroom. The sound was distinct, a harsh mechanical noise that signaled the permanent end of his unearned freedom. His wrists were bound tightly together, forcing his shoulders to slump forward in a posture of ultimate defeat. The golden boy, the favored son who could do no wrong, was reduced to a sniveling, shackled suspect. Nathan twisted his neck, his bloodshot eyes frantically scanning the room. He looked at Alexander Montgomery, hoping the billionaire might intervene to save a fellow entrepreneur. Alexander simply crossed his arms, his face a mask of stone. Realizing he had no allies left among the elite, Nathan turned his desperate, searching gaze toward me. He looked at the sister he had bullied, marginalized, and stolen from for decades. He searched my features for a sliver of the quiet, obedient girl he used to banish to the hallway during his parties. "Victoria, please," Nathan choked out, his voice a ragged, pathetic whine. Tears spilled over his eyelashes, cutting fresh tracks through the sweat on his cheeks. "Tell them to stop. We are family. Show some mercy. I will pay you back every cent. I will give you equity in my export firm. Just call off your lawyers." He was bartering with counterfeit currency, offering equity in a seized fraudulent shell company to the billionaire who already owned his debt was the ultimate display of his profound financial ignorance. I looked down at him, my expression steady and unreadable. I felt no sorrow, no vindication, and zero lingering resentment. I felt only the sterile clinical satisfaction of balancing a corrupted ledger. "Family does not forge signatures, Nathan," I stated, my words ringing clear and precise over the ambient hum of the projectors. "And a true chief executive officer does not beg." The finality of my rejection severed the last fraying thread of his hope. His chin dropped to his chest. The fight drained from his body, leaving him a hollow, trembling shell. He stopped resisting the officers, allowing them to turn him toward the center aisle. The police marched the groom through the sea of staring guests. High society matrons pulled their silk wraps tighter, avoiding his gaze, while business tycoons typed rapid emails to their compliance departments, ensuring their portfolios were scrubbed clean of the Mitchell name. The red taillights of the police cruisers strobed through the tall glass windows, waiting to transport him to a federal holding cell. As the heavy double doors closed behind the police escort, the oppressive tension in the grand ballroom shifted. The primary threat was neutralized, handcuffed, and removed from the board. But a syndicate requires accomplices to function. My brother did not build his mountain of debt alone. He relied on a foundation of willful ignorance and toxic enabling to sustain his grand charade. I turned my attention away from the exit and slowly shifted my gaze toward the VIP family table situated near the front of the stage. Caroline and Edward remained seated in their gilded chairs, their faces drained of all color, resembling statues carved from gray stone. They had just watched their beloved son hauled away in irons, their minds entirely consumed by the shock of his arrest. They sat in paralyzed silence, mourning the death of their social standing. However, they were still blissfully ignorant of the secondary trap waiting in the shadows. They had yet to realize that the fraudulent commercial loans financing this entire disaster bore their own signatures. The fallout was preparing to hit the enablers, and their reckoning was due. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing the sight of the flashing police lights from the pristine interior of the ballroom. The sudden absence of the groom left a vacuum of power, but it was quickly filled by the frantic, chaotic energy of the two people who had enabled his delusion for 3 decades. Caroline and Edward broke from their paralyzed state at the VIP table. The shock that had glued them to their gilded chairs shattered. Caroline stumbled forward, her designer heels catching awkwardly on the edge of the plush carpet. Edward followed close behind, his breathing shallow and rapid. They rushed toward the elevated wooden stage, their faces contorted into masks of raw, unfiltered terror. For years, they had meticulously curated an image of flawless suburban royalty, using my brother as the crown jewel of their fabricated success, while pushing me into the shadows. Now the jewel was locked in a federal transport vehicle, and the shadows were creeping up to swallow them whole. Caroline reached the edge of the platform, gripping the wooden trim with trembling fingers. Her carefully styled hair had fallen out of place, strands sticking to the sweat on her forehead. She did not ask where the police were taking her son. She did not inquire about his legal representation or his physical safety. Her panic bypassed maternal concern and drilled straight into the core of her true obsession. "How could you do this to your own brother?" Caroline shrieked, her voice cracked, echoing shrilly across the silent, cavernous hall. She pointed a shaking finger up at my face, ignoring the undeniable reality that Nathan had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her mind simply refused to process his guilt. In her twisted logic, I was the villain for exposing the crime, not the son who committed it. "We will lose the house!" Her words hung in the air, a pathetic testament to her priorities. She was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment, yet her primary concern was the loss of the brick-and-mortar status symbol she used to impress her country club peers. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling the last remaining threads of biological obligations snap and dissolve into dust. My expression hardened into impenetrable ice. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that carried to the furthest corners of the room. "You lost the house the exact moment you decided my inheritance was a slush fund for your golden child," I replied evenly. Edward stepped up beside his wife, his chest heaving under his rented tuxedo jacket. He opened his mouth to launch a familiar tirade, likely preparing to demand respect and assert his paternal dominance. He never got the chance to speak. Vincent stepped smoothly into the breach, cutting off my father before a single syllable could form. My elite corporate attorney reached into his leather briefcase one final time. He extracted a separate, slim legal folder bound in dark gray cardstock. He held it out, extending his arm until the edge of the folder pressed lightly against Edward's chest. Edward Mitchell Vincent stated, his tone carrying the sterile, unyielding weight of the judicial system. "This contains the immediate default notices on the commercial loans you willingly co-signed. The lending institution initiated rapid recovery protocols the minute the wire fraud investigation became active." Edward hesitated, his hands shaking as he took the gray folder. He flipped the cover open. His eyes darted across the dense legal paragraphs, scanning the bold text detailing the acceleration clauses and asset forfeiture mandates. He read the exact dollar amounts of the crippling debt he had legally bound himself to when he decided to finance Nathan in his fake export business. The color drained from Edward's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His knees visibly buckled, forcing him to lean heavily against the edge of the stage just to remain upright. The paperwork confirmed the fatal consequences of his blind favoritism. The bank was seizing the property. The retirement accounts were frozen. The suburban fortress was gone. The social execution of Caroline and Edward unfolded with brutal, instantaneous efficiency. The elite country club friends seated at the surrounding VIP tables had witnessed the entire exchange. These were people who thrived on networking and proximity to power. They possessed an inherent radar for financial contamination. Seeing the Mitchell patriarch holding his own bankruptcy notices triggered a collective silent retreat. Men in expensive suits shifted their chairs, physically turning their backs toward the stage. Women in silk gowns lowered their eyes, picking up their napkins to avoid making any accidental eye contact with Caroline. The whispered gossip ceased. The guests created an invisible, impenetrable barrier of isolation around my parents. They treated the weeping couple like an active contagion, eager to distance themselves from the stench of poverty and scandal. Caroline looked over her shoulder, seeking a sympathetic gaze from the women she had played tennis with just days ago. She found only cold shoulders and the backs of heads. The realization of her total social erasure hit her harder than the loss of the real estate. She let out a hollow, agonizing sob, collapsing against Edward's arm. They were entirely alone in a room filled with 300 people. The false reality they had worshipped for 30 years had evaporated, leaving them with nothing but the devastating truth of their own greed. The resolution of the immediate threat demanded a physical cleansing of the venue. Alexander Montgomery stepped forward, reassuming his undisputed role as the public face of the hospitality conglomerate. He did not look at my parents with anger. He looked at them with the detached clinical boredom of an executive dismissing an irrelevant nuisance. He raised his hand, signaling the resort-heavy security team stationed near the perimeter. 4 broad-shouldered guards dressed in dark suits moved swiftly down the center aisle, their footsteps synchronized and purposeful. They closed in on the stage, forming a tight, imposing ring around my sobbing parents. "This is a private corporate event, and your presence is a severe liability," Alexander informed my parents coldly. His voice lacked any trace of the polite hospitality he typically offered his paying guests. "You are officially trespassing on Great Lakes Hospitality property. You will leave the premises immediately." Edward tried to straighten his posture, desperately grasping for a final shred of his evaporated dignity. He clutched the default notices to his chest, opening his mouth to protest the ejection. The lead security guard stepped into Edward's personal space, placing a heavy, unmistakable hand on my father's shoulder. The silent physical warning was clear. Any resistance would be met with forceful removal. Caroline shrank back, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands. The security guards flanked the weeping couple, offering no room for negotiation. They smoothly and firmly turned my parents away from the stage, marching them down the long, carpeted aisle toward the rear exit. The remaining high society guests watched in absolute silence as the once proud family was paraded through the hall. Caroline and Edward were stripped of their dignity, their fake wealth, and their unearned status. The heavy wooden doors opened to the cool night air, swallowing the 2 enablers into the darkness. I stood on the elevated stage, watching the doors swing shut, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of a lifetime of subservience lift entirely from my shoulders. The ballroom, once a monument to their toxic delusion, was now the exact site of my undeniable victory. 6 months later, the frigid Wisconsin winter thawed into a crisp, bright spring. I sat behind a sweeping mahogany desk in the corner office of my expanded corporate headquarters in downtown Milwaukee. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered an unobstructed, breathtaking view of Lake Michigan. The water stretched out toward the horizon, a deep, churning expanse of navy blue reflecting the morning sunlight. The environment radiated a profound structural tranquility. There were no rented tuxedos, no panicked whispers, and no frantic attempts to maintain a fractured illusion. I took a slow sip of hot black coffee from a ceramic mug, savoring the rich, bitter roast. The silence in my executive suite was not the suffocating, oppressive quiet of the parking lot tent. It was the vast, liberating stillness of total victory. The dust from the shattered wedding reception had long since settled into the earth, leaving behind a fundamentally altered landscape. The legal machinery of the United States government operates with a relentless, grinding efficiency once supplied with pristine digital evidence. Nathan no longer wears custom-tailored suits or swirls vintage champagne in crystal flutes. He currently wears a standard-issue khaki uniform, serving a mandatory 5-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary. The white-collar crime division dismantled his fictitious export firm in a matter of days. The venture capitalists he tried to court evaporated instantly, treating his name like a toxic hazard. The federal prosecutors utilized the exact routing numbers and forged escrow documents I provided to secure a swift, undeniable conviction for interstate wire fraud. He lost his freedom, his fraudulent reputation, and the superficial bride who fled at the first sign of financial ruin. His so-called empire, built entirely on my stolen inheritance, was reduced to nothing more than a few digitized court records and a lingering cautionary tale whispered among local investors. He traded his golden boy pedestal for a concrete cell, finally forced to face a reality he could not manipulate with a charming smile. The daily routine of roll calls and confined spaces stripped away the arrogant tech titan persona, revealing the hollow, terrified grifter hiding underneath. He has plenty of time to contemplate the price of stealing from a silent architect. The fallout for my parents proved even more poetic. Caroline and Edward Mitchell lost their sprawling suburban fortress the very week following the disastrous reception. The commercial lending institution, acting on the default notices Vincent delivered, seized the property to satisfy the catastrophic debts they willingly co-signed. Their beloved country club memberships were immediately revoked due to unpaid dues and the sheer radioactive scandal attached to their public disgrace. The elite friends who once attended their lavish dinner parties severed all contact, blocking their numbers and turning away whenever they spotted them in public. Stripped of their home, their savings, and their cherished societal ranking, my parents faced the harsh, unforgiving landscape of genuine poverty. Desperation forced them to seek employment just to afford the rent on a cramped, dingy apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. Through a flawless stroke of karmic alignment, they found entry-level administrative positions at a regional agricultural logistics center. They spend their days filing shipping manifests, answering ringing telephones, and logging inventory for a sprawling dairy supply chain. My mother, who once turned up her nose at anything lacking a designer label, now wears a stiff polyester uniform taking orders from shift supervisors half her age. My father, who boasted about non-existent investments, now spends his afternoons calculating freight loads and organizing delivery schedules for bulk milk shipments. They punch a time clock every morning, terrified of losing their meager paychecks, completely unaware that the agricultural center employing them is a subsidiary directly owned by one of my anonymous blind trusts. The daughter they hid in a tent, the woman they deemed a socially awkward disappointment, quietly signs their paychecks. The sheer delicious irony of their new existence remains the ultimate silent triumph. They are finally doing honest, grueling work for the exact legacy they previously mocked, answering to the very empire they tried to discard. The heavy wooden door to my office clicked open, interrupting my quiet reflection. Alexander Montgomery walked in carrying a leather portfolio and projecting the same towering, effortless authority he displayed on the night of the reception. Our dynamic evolved significantly over the past 6 months. The hospitality chief executive was no longer just a spectator to my domestic reckoning. He transitioned into my most trusted business ally. We recognized a shared, uncompromising drive within each other. He took a seat across from my desk, opening the portfolio to reveal a stack of complex architectural blueprints. We were currently mapping out a joint venture, a sprawling, sustainable eco-resort planned for the northern Wisconsin coastline. Alexander pointed to the structural schematics, discussing supply chain logistics and environmental zoning permits with sharp, analytical precision. We communicated in the seamless language of corporate strategy, exchanging ideas with mutual respect and unbroken parity. He treated me not as a fragile liability, but as a formidable peer who commanded her domain. Our partnership thrived on transparency and a relentless pursuit of excellence. We spent the next hour refining the cost analysis for the sustainable building materials our mines, operating in perfect synchronization. The new project promised to double our regional footprint, transforming prime waterfront acreage into a premier destination that honored the natural geography of the Great Lakes. Looking at the blueprints, I felt a deep, resonant alignment with the path I had chosen. For years, I allowed my family to dictate my worth, quietly shrinking my presence to accommodate their towering, fragile egos. I accepted their insults, their dismissive glares, and their banishment, erroneously believing that enduring their toxicity was the only way to maintain peace. I played the role of the clumsy data entry clerk because it kept the target off my back while I secured my financial foundation. But attempting to fit into a poisonous narrative only delays your inevitable rise. The moment I stopped accepting their fictional hierarchy, the moment I recognized the sheer potency of my own intellect, the chains simply fell away. I weaponized my silence, turning their underestimation into the ultimate tactical advantage. By operating undetected in the shadows, I built an impenetrable fortress of wealth and legal leverage right beneath their feet. I did not need to scream for validation or demand their respect. I let the raw, undeniable data execute the takeover on my behalf. Their ruin was not an act of fiery vengeance, but a calculated mathematical certainty. They handed me the rope, and I simply tied the knot. True power never requires a loud, desperate performance in a crowded ballroom. It does not seek the approval of fickle elite crowds or rely on forged signatures to project strength. Authentic power waits patiently in the quiet dark. It analyzes the variables, secures the perimeter, and prepares the legal snares. It trusts the process and relies on disciplined execution rather than flashy posturing. The most dangerous individual in any room is rarely the one holding the microphone or pouring the expensive champagne. The most formidable threat is the quiet observer sitting in the corner, tracking the mistakes, cataloging the vulnerabilities, and waiting to strike. My journey from the sweltering parking lot tent to the pinnacle of a commercial real estate empire stands as a testament to the undeniable strength of self-reliance. I reclaimed the dairy farm legacy my grandfather entrusted to me, elevating it beyond anything my superficial relatives could ever comprehend. I purged the rot from my bloodline and emerged stronger, sharper, and permanently untouchable. As I looked out over the sweeping expanse of the lake, feeling the solid oak of my desk beneath my fingertips, I knew the ghost they tried to bury had become the architect of a new, unyielding kingdom. Let them punch their time clocks and sweep their cramped apartment floors. I have an empire to run, and the horizon has never looked brighter. We often look at the collapse of a family and search for a single catastrophic event to shoulder the blame. We point to a bad investment, a sudden betrayal, or a dark secret revealed in the harsh light of a grand ballroom. But the quiet, terrifying truth is that the destruction of the Mitchell family did not begin when Nathan forged a signature, nor did it start when Victoria hijacked the projector screens at a high society wedding. The rot took root decades earlier, planted in the fertile rolling farmlands of Wisconsin, disguised as parental love. When we reflect on the spectacular downfall of Caroline, Edward, and their golden child, we are not merely examining a corporate revenge thriller. We are staring into the devastating mirror of failed parenting, warped family responsibility, and the perilous pursuit of the American illusion. In traditional American culture, we hold certain truths to be self-evident within the walls of our homes. We believe in the meritocracy of hard work, the virtue of honesty, and the sacred duty of a parent to guide their children with an even, fair hand. Victoria's grandfather understood this philosophy implicitly. He built a dairy legacy on the cold, punishing coastlines of the Great Lakes using sweat, calloused hands, and unrelenting integrity. He understood that a full silo stands still, while an empty barrel makes the most noise. Yet, Caroline and Edward allowed that foundational American value to erode. They traded the dirt and diesel fuel of authentic labor for the synthetic sheen of leased luxury cars and country club memberships. In doing so, they did not just ruin their own finances, they fundamentally failed their primary duty as parents. They raised a son who believed the appearance of success was a valid substitute for the character required to achieve it. Nathan's descent into federal wire fraud was not an accident. It was a curated inevitability. When parents elevate one child to the status of a flawless prince while banishing another to the shadows, they do a profound disservice to both. By constantly shielding Nathan from the consequences of his laziness and praising his empty charisma, Caroline and Edward stripped him of the opportunity to develop true resilience. They taught him that his worth was tied exclusively to his ability to project wealth and dominance. In their desperate, blinding need for high society status, they became willing accomplices to his delusion. They co-signed substantial commercial loans, literally betting the roof over their heads to sustain his fabricated export empire. This is the ultimate perversion of family responsibility. True parental guidance is not writing a blank check to cover a child's fraud. It is possessing the emotional awareness to say no, to demand accountability, and to let them fail when failure is the only teacher capable of delivering a lasting lesson. On the other end of this toxic spectrum stood Victoria. Banished to a sweltering parking lot tent, wearing a clearance rack dress, she was treated as a diseased outcast simply because she did not fit her parents' superficial aesthetic. The emotional blindness required for a mother to look at her own daughter and see nothing but an embarrassment is staggering. Emotional awareness in parenting demands that we recognize and nurture the unique strengths of each child, regardless of whether those strengths align with our own vanity. Victoria was forced to shrink her existence, hiding her natural brilliance to accommodate her brother's fragile ego. Yet this gross parental neglect inadvertently forged an impenetrable fortress. By depriving her of their superficial validation, Caroline and Edward gave Victoria the rare gift of silent, unmonitored autonomy. They pushed her into the shadows, entirely unaware that the dark is the perfect place to build an empire. Stories like Victoria's resonate deeply because they expose the uncomfortable realities hiding behind manicured suburban lawns and perfect family portraits. They remind us that the dynamics we tolerate in our living rooms eventually shape the boardrooms and courtrooms of our future. If you have ever felt like the invisible pillar holding up a fragile family, or if you find strength in narratives that pull back the curtain on human nature, I encourage you to hit like and subscribe to Grape Echo Stories. We navigate the intricate, often messy intersections of life, justice, and the unspoken truths that bind us together. Join our community and share your own experiences in the comments below. As we look at our own lives, at the children we raise, and the familial ties we maintain, we must ask ourselves a terrifying question. Are we cultivating genuine character, or are we simply leasing an illusion? Are we loving our children for who they are, or for the status they can confer upon us? The greatest failure of a parent is not a lack of wealth, but a lack of vision, the inability to see the quiet architect sitting right in front of them, waiting in the tent. Societal conditioning dictates that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred covenant that must be preserved regardless of the cost. We are taught to forgive endlessly, to turn the other cheek, and to prioritize bloodlines over personal boundaries. But the story of the Mitchell family presents a far more complex, perhaps uncomfortable reality. Victoria's ultimate triumph was not achieved through reconciliation or therapeutic family dialogues. Her peace was secured through decisive, unapologetic severance. She did not heal her family. She legally and financially excised the rot. This challenges the conventional wisdom that a good child must always seek to repair a fractured home. Sometimes, the most responsible, ethical action a person can take is to let the burning house collapse. Caroline and Edward's descent into poverty, forced to punch a time clock at a dairy logistics center owned by the daughter they discarded, is not just a tale of karmic retribution. It is a harsh, unflinching lesson in the natural laws of accountability. You cannot nurture deception and expect to harvest loyalty. You cannot steal from the earth and expect anything to grow in its place. We are conditioned to believe that unconditional love is the highest virtue a family can possess. But perhaps that is the greatest lie we tell ourselves to excuse toxic behavior. True love within a family cannot be unconditional. It must be fiercely conditional upon mutual respect, honesty, and basic human decency. Blood may draft the opening chapter of your life, but it does not entitle anyone to hold the pen for the rest of your story. In the end, family is not a biological right. It is a privilege that must be continuously